To start off here, I've been working since last summer with the Knox County Historical Society. I'm from Knoxville, Illinois, and the Historical Society for the county runs a museum in our town and a couple of other historical sites too. And they're preparing to conduct a project regarding one-room schoolhouses in the area. They've been preparing to do this since last August, so I have to say holding out hope gets more difficult. But they're off to a good start with me. So, my background with the group started this summer regarding their Veterans History Project, where I sat in on a group interview, which was my grandfather and another veteran, which could have been turned into the oral history of my grandfather glaring at someone over their claim to be on a submarine for 18 months, but that was still very interesting. And then I did a larger project specifically with my grandfather, which was also pretty nifty. And the stories in that ranged from busting up cars in the desert to befriending condemned people. So that was something that gave me an idea before even entering the class of how wide-ranging oral history could be. So being able to work with the Knox County Historical Society has also meant I can eventually get this project to the Newman School Historical Site, which is in the local park. And I haven't heard back emails about that lately, but I have plenty prepared for them, so I hope they eventually want it. So the oral history interview was conducted on November 28, 2014. The interviewee was Helen Stewart, who is my grandmother and a former student of the Wakers School in Victoria, Illinois. The interview was conducted at her house, and I've been hoping to interview her at the kitchen table, but rather she insisted on having the interview in the living room, which was directly under a vent, and I was slightly unhappy about that and spent the entire interview panicking about whether my recording would turn out or not. But at the very least, the chairs were incredibly comfortable, so in that respect, it was ideal. So, problems during the interview were that the school system in Victoria, Illinois changed so frequently that almost all of the pre-interview research I'd done was completely incorrect. So, I had a variety of information from probably the teens to the late 1930s, in which the school system in Victoria was fragmented by grades, so different age levels would go to different schoolhouses, which I thought was really fascinating and not terribly common. So I had several questions about that. When I went in and mentioned that to my grandmother, she was like, that is not exactly true, but she was very happy to set me straight, and I think she found it funny too. So that actually helped the interview being wrong because it put my interviewee in what seemed to be a good mood. And before the interview, I was also informed that if my family wanted our stuffing at Thanksgiving dinner, I was not to go on for more than an hour, which she repeated 2 or 3 times. She actually went over the hour, and I was trying to limit it towards the end, and she was more than happy to go over it. So she did choose to disregard the time limit she'd set, and as I left, I saw the finished stuffing. So I'm not 100% sure what to make of that, but that's how it went. So what did I learn about schoolhouses? One of the most interesting things I learned about was district organization. Every town served as its own set of sub-districts, and the districts were set up so that every few families would be able to go to one schoolhouse. So that meant that you had roughly 20 students per schoolhouse, from being very small children, the first grade level now, up until 8th grade. So those 20 kids from each schoolhouse would then be able to funnel into the high schools, which were not in every town, but were in every few towns after the one-room schoolhouse experience. I also learned quite a bit about what students learned, what classroom materials were used, and how teachers managed the classrooms. I was incredibly curious about classroom management because it seemed very difficult to manage a group of children from 6 to 13. But my grandmother, when we were talking, did not seem to think that was much of a problem. She was just like, well, we all behave then. We're not like kids today, which having substitute taught I could kind of agree with. If it was a room full of those children, it would have been terrifying. But apparently, at that point, all students were saints. But they were the same subjects that we're familiar with today. The spelling, reading, writing, science, math, history. She talked a little more about reading and spelling and literature and writing too, but there were okay details on the rest of them too. And I learned that they did a weekly spelling bee counting all of the students in all of the classrooms, which seems extreme. And I wanted to know more about how you would stratify the skills of the spelling words, but that questioning did not yield much because I think I was asking incredibly specific questions about things that happened over 50 years ago, which may not have been the best oral history strategy. So we also talked about how students dress for school, what they ate, and how they socialized, which the dress was fairly formal, skirts for girls, nice pants for boys, blouses and dress shirts for everyone. What they ate actually yielded one of the most interesting sets of information because she talked about every month the government would give the school some canned beans, and they get very happy because they heat up the canned beans in the wood-burning stove that served as a classroom heater. So then once in a while they just have government beans day, and I had no idea that something like that could have possibly happened, but I found it delightful that it did. And how they socialized was that all the kids of all the age groups would apparently just get along with each other because it was such a small group. There wasn't too much trouble with the younger kids and the older kids being snotty to each other. So you'd have on the playground, they naturally group off by age, but there was no strife between the different age groups. I also got some incredibly detailed descriptions of playground games. There were some typical ones like Red Rover, but the additional details regarding potential injuries caused by said games was my favorite. Apparently, a playground favorite at Laker School was to have one student stand on each side of a tin storage shed and throw sticks over the roof of the storage shed at each other and see if the person who wasn't looking could catch it. And I said, didn't kids get hurt playing that? And she was like, sure, but they understood what could happen. So I would like to know more about the size of the sticks. Were the kids blindfolded, things like that? But as you'll see, I was very easily distracted in asking my questions. So what else did I learn? A lot of local history. So I learned what teachers from Laker School were related to what current Knox County business owners. I learned that one of our mechanics and someone who used to work at an appliance store were both related to teachers that my grandmother had had. So that was interesting. I don't know that it would be terribly interesting outside of Knoxville, but it was cool to hear stuff like that. I also learned the history of the copy machine and the fact that in the middle of an oral history interview for class, if my grandmother mentions how copies were made from the one-room schoolhouse days to when she was teaching, I will sit for 10 minutes and keep asking her questions about it. So currently in the UIS Oral History Archives, there are about 10 minutes on the history of the copy machine and what was available to teachers in Knox County, Illinois, from when she was a student in the earliest days up until the 1980s. So I also learned about, and I had no expectation of this whatsoever, the college admissions process for Illinois women in the 1940s and the relative rarity of college attendance in our area. So rather than actually applying for college and going through the admissions process, they would ask in the county, the women at the high school, would you like to go to college, starting at the top grades and working their way down? So she said she was third or fourth in the grades level, but there was such little interest in college that no one before her had accepted the chance to go. So when they asked, would you like to go to college, she just said sure and went to study teaching, and that was how she got in at Western Illinois University. So I thought that was very interesting, and it wasn't something I expected to learn going into this. So What's next? I completed the UIS aspects of this project. As many of you might have guessed, this was done for Dr. Kent's 520 class, as the rest of the presentations in the session were. And I donated the interview to the UIS archives, as I previously said. I haven't checked to make sure it's there, but if you would like to learn about one-room schoolhouses or, of course, copy machines, and the information on that is interesting, I was listening again last night and thinking, yeah, I did a good job asking about these. Then you can go check that out. I also have to deal more with the Knox County Historical Society, which has dried up a bit, but that doesn't mean I don't still periodically bother them. So I need to meet with the head of the society to discuss the content of the interview and decide if further interviews are necessary, which I keep getting back about that. Sure, just let me know and we'll meet for coffee at McDonald's. And nothing has really happened there despite these repeated offers and my repeated emails, but we'll see. So yes, that process has begun. And I'm also to create 2 documents, an edited piece for Newman School, which is a museum, as I mentioned, at the park that's frequented by grade school trips and stuff like that. They open it up at Christmas. And also a standard transcript for the Knoxville Museum, which I've worked quite a bit on the transcript past what I've done for Dr. Kent's class, and I'm horrified by the fact both that I had a totally stuffy nose during the interview, and that every time my grandmother said something, I would go, oh, wow. So I'm very annoying on that transcript, but that's okay. And this will be written more as standard prose, and focusing on the details such as games and educational experiences, and probably the government beans, because I don't feel like grade schoolers would care too much about the original purple Xerox copies. But with all of that said, that is it. Enjoy the black screen of doom. Does anyone have any questions?
There is time for a question or two if people want to ask.
Yes.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. So Joe's experience was that he concluded, based on his kind of primary source research, that his interviewee didn't necessarily give him the most accurate information. And you said that you concluded or reached a conclusion in your interview that some of your other research had misled you or was wrong. And I was just wondering if you'd given some other thought to maybe how that tension could be reconciled, or how do you get a validity between the different accounts that maybe you found in your research versus in your oral history?
Well, I had looked into it, and the research that was available to people did not go as late as when my grandmother had been attending the one-room schoolhouses. So I do believe that she was correct in this, but if I do get the chance to do further interviews regarding this project, then it would be very cool to see what their recollections were and how everything matched up. So, in short, I'm not 100% sure yet, but I do believe her over the dicey and spotty research that was available on a website that looked like it was done by GeoCities in 1999.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alison.
Thank you.